Hello and welcome to Comic Boom, the comics and education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Lucy Starbuck-Bradley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian, or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and hopefully to provide some inspiration to influence your practice and shine a light along the way on some titles that you can bring into your libraries, your classrooms, and hopefully onto your bookshelves at home too. This episode of Comic Boom is sponsored by ALCS, the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society. That's right, guys, we have got a sponsor. It's hugely exciting for me as it means that I have some contribution this season towards the cost of researching, recording, editing, promoting and publishing the podcast, which had previously been all costs that I'd covered myself. So it's really secured the podcast future, and a huge thanks go out to ALCS for seeing the value in what I'm doing in this podcast and putting their support behind it. You will find out a little bit more in the end sections of each podcast about ALCS, and I'm just going to be highlighting towards the end of each show some of their resources which you might find useful in your classroom. To kickstart season 5 of the podcast, we have a guest I've admired for a long time. So much, in fact, that I've put off inviting him onto the podcast that whole time. You may remember Helen Jones and I discussing his work in her episode. It is, of course, Nick Sousanis. Nick is an Eisner-winning comics author, an associate professor in liberal studies at San Francisco State University, where he started and runs an interdisciplinary comics studies program. He is the author of Unflattening, originally his doctoral dissertation, which he wrote and drew entirely in comics form. Published by Harvard University Press in 2015, Unflattening received the 2016 American Publishers Association Humanities Award for Scholarly Excellence and the 2016 Lind Ward Prize for Best Graphic Novel. Sousanis' comics have appeared in Nature, the Boston Globe, Columbia Magazine, and MIT Technology Review. He has also got an absolutely incredibly rich resource of a website, www.spinweaveandcut.com. You'll find all of those details in the show notes, but the website in particular, huge resource for starting to explore the role that comics can have in education and finding some really insightful blogs, activities, exercises, downloads, and some really rich comics on the topic on there as well. So definitely recommended. But now, this is actually quite a bumper length episode to kick off the season, because once Nick and I started, we could not stop. We absolutely loved talking to him. I very much look forward to talking to him again at some point in the future. He's such a thoughtful practitioner and someone that's really entrenched in the use of comics. But you can tell, I think, from the conversation that it is a journey. It's something that is a live exploratory practice for him. It's not something that he's kind of drawn all the conclusions on and is putting his feet up and just sort of churning out the same information lecture after lecture. He's definitely developing and growing his practice as he learns from what he does. He's a very interesting person. I hope you find this episode as interesting as I did. Here's what Nick had to say. Hello, Nick. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. I'm very excited to have you on the show. Your work has been recommended by previous guests and we've discussed it in earlier episodes, so it's brilliant to have you on. To start off, can you tell us a bit about your journey as a comics reader? Where did that all start for you?
Yeah, it started really young. I have a much older brother who read comics to me with me when I was a baby, so Batman ends up being my first word. Something I managed to somewhat accidentally replicate with both of my kids now. It's an easy word to say. So I was interested in them very young. I think it helped, learning to read at a really young age. And I just kept being into them. And then I think I also, was one of the kids who could draw things that look like things at a young age. So I just kept doing that. So I was into them as a reader and into them as a maker from as long as I can. Before I can remember, I was into them. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. This is one of the questions that I ask people as kind of always a first question on the podcast. And so often is family or there's someone that's almost passed on the bug down through generations, or it's a sibling or it's a friend at school. It's this there seems to be this relational aspect to passing on of comics. Is that something that you've noticed when you've talked to other people about it?
I mean, That's interesting. I mean, certainly that is, I get students who otherwise might not have been comics readers, but they had a parent that had a stash of them or something like that. I don't know. I mean, my own case was just because we had them around and I read them and then we kept buying them. I don't think my mom wasn't against them, but not really a particular reader of them. But my dad read them too, and had grown up, as a little kid with things like Shazam and things like that. So I think it was just around and part of what we did, and you tune into them really quickly.
Yeah. And what was it, do you think, that helped you sustain that interest? I'm sure there's people who kind of dip in and out of reading comics, or they had them around, but it's not something that then becomes a real focus of their life or their reading habits long term. What do you think it is that's helped you to have that sustained interest?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know that I'm going to be able to answer it. I think I liked them. I liked the stories. I think there's probably something about the sort of moral of the superhero thing, which I still read superhero comics, but I'm much less interested in them now. But I think there's something to not so much the power fantasy, but in the like doing the right thing, despite being difficult, that I like, and I'm often kind of disgusted with modern superhero comics because they mostly seem about torture and things. I mean, not torture, but they just seem so heavy, and the sort of sense of like just doing good things doesn't always seem to be part of them, which I understand it's the real world, but that's not what we're necessarily reading superhero comics for.
Yeah, that escapism element.
Yeah, the escapism, but also being just and being, whatever. They're childlike things, but they're still, I like that about it. And I there's also the serial nature of those particular kinds of comics, that, you enter this world and you have history of the different adventures they have and how they connect. When my daughter, my older kid, was little, we started reading My Little Pony comics, which we never really saw the show, but the comics were quite well made, both for me as like a teacher. I use elements of them in my teaching, but they also had this sort of ongoing larger narrative that we could keep track of and get to know the characters and pieced it together. It was really interesting to be part of their world. And I think that is one of the strengths of, it's why people watch soap operas, I assume too. But one of the strengths is you enter this fictional world and you're part of those characters' lives and you're interested to see how they're doing, what they're up to, what struggles they're having, what successes they're having. So I think I like that. And then obviously I liked, as somebody who began to like drawing very early and kept at it, the visual aspect of it really appealed to me. I mean, I like certain kinds of drawing, and that always stayed with me. Even when some of the other interests have lapsed, I'm always interested in the visual dynamic of the page.
What sort of things were you? So you said you were interested in superheroes, but you maybe moved away from that a little bit now with your reading preferences. So what kind of things interest you now in terms of your reading habits?
Oh boy. So, I still read those because, it's that serial nature. So I read a little bit of that, but this is where I like turn to my bookshelf to look. I read a lot of things that relate to my class. So which try to find things that are formally interesting, because that's a lot how I approach my work. I read things like memoir comics, which didn't exist when I was reading. If I think about what I read as a kid, like, that's just all I had access to. There were other kinds of comics, but I never saw them.
Yeah.
I wasn't near any of the sort of specialty shops that would have had some alternative or any of that kind of thing. But today it's unreal what's possible, both for myself, for my teaching, and for my kids reading. I do more of my own personal reading with my kids because that's what I have time for. Yeah. There's just so many good kids comics, from fantasy that is well told, things like Hilda, which I just think is brilliant. Cartooning and was a brilliant show too.
Yeah, I love Hilda.
To things like When Stars Are Scattered, which is dealing with a really, really difficult subject, and yet I could read it with I don't know if she was 7 or 8 when we read it, and she'll read it again on her own. So I think it's just such an exciting time for comics to go from, I like the stuff I read. It was fun, but now you can read about all different kinds of people and in different kinds of contexts. and in many different ways of storytelling too. They're not quite the more straightforward narratives and straightforward drawing styles that were the only thing available at some point. Which those are things I still like, but now there's so many other options that it's just really an exciting time to be part of comics, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that sometimes when there's hesitance or around having comics available for children in school libraries, for example, or using them in the classroom, a lot of that comes from just not understanding that change that's happened over the years and the breadth that's now available and the range that can cater to so many different tastes. So yeah, it's that kind of part of the mission of this podcast is to try and kind of spread the word about some of those different titles as well. Although largely preaching to the converted, but it all helps.
It all helps, right? But it is a funny thing. I mean, I always poll my students who got in trouble for drawing in class, but also who got in trouble for reading or bringing comics to school, and those things persist. Every time you think, well, we're done winning, we're done with that, there's still plenty of pockets of it where they're like, well, when are you going to read real books?
Yeah, for sure.
It comes from this very narrow thing. And I even get it with my work. They're like, oh, you did your dissertation in comics. Like, who's your superhero? What's the characters? And I'm like, well, no superhero, and there's really no story. And I just have to show them because
it's hard for people to conceptualize.
If that's your perception. I mean, even people who are like, oh, I like that kind of thing, they still don't get that comics can be more things. I mean, and even my students who come who are like, yeah, I want to learn more about comics because I really like this and this. They leave thinking about things like graphic medicine and how they can tell personal narratives or health narratives or think about poetry in comics, things that just never occurred to them going in, but coming out, they see them as this really complex communication vehicle for all kinds of things that just never would have occurred to them. And probably, wouldn't have occurred to me. Like I would have said, these are, this is a place to tell action and fun stories. And I don't think about them in the same way anymore.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then one of the things that came up actually a few episodes ago when I talked to academic from here in England, from Birmingham, Kevin Hoffin, and he's studying for PhD and looking at comics pedagogy. And he was talking about different strands, different ways that comics can be used in education. And one of the things that he was referencing some research around comics being not, and it's something that's a theme that's recurring in your work as well, around comics being a way of actually not just a way to document our thoughts, but actually that the process of creating comics and drawing and working with image and text can help us to kind of think through things in new ways. But I think that's something that we haven't really dug into on the podcast. And I just wonder if you can explain that kind of idea for listeners and maybe help us unpack it a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I can explain it, but I definitely can address it. I mean, so in my case, I was a comics maker. And so when I came back to do, when I decided to do my dissertation in comics, my main thought was that I was going to make things accessible, right? That I was going to make big ideas in academia accessible, not easy. I don't think anybody would describe comics I make as easy reading, and not lighter or like, but that the use of images and stuff would I could transcend some of the limitations of vocabulary and language that would keep people out of ordinary scholarship. So that's how I approached it. But I think in doing it, in the process of making it, what I really came to see is how much the very act of making comics, for me at least, was a different way of thinking. It allowed me to ask questions and get at my own thinking and get at the way I did research in ways that I just wouldn't have done if I was writing text. And I wouldn't have done too. I mean, this is sort of important in my process, which doesn't apply to everybody, that, I don't write a script or a description of the thing and then add pictures to it. Mine comes out of these big sketch maps where I'm like, well, here's ideas I have, here's drawings I have that are all kind of one thing. And then that prompts me to, all right, well, I need to know more about this. So I'm reading about more stuff, and that prompts more ideas for how to compose and more ideas for what words need to be included. And they're always pushing each other back and forth. The words are suggesting things to the pictures. The pictures are suggesting what words I can use. The constraints that I've had, whether it's finished a chapter a while ago using only circular composition. So like I have to solve problems in a different way than if I'd solve problems using only rectangles or some other format, which leads me in different directions. So again, I mean, I have a lot of answers to this. I think it's just comics are not as simple as we've attached pictures to words, that the ways words and pictures interact, the way the space interacts, changes how you read and changes how you can think with it. And one example I like to give with slides, I have a page of in Unflattening about the transformative power of stories. It's using Scheherazade, or the Arabian Nights stories.
Yeah.
And so it's a series of zooms from one image that has a zoom in of the next image and so on. And in doing that page, like it was one of the few things I knew kind of early on that I would like to play with that. And it was very late in the book, but it was early on in my notes. But in the middle of the page, I wanted to make this point that by stories, because I'm talking about stories here, by stories, I didn't just mean the fanciful or the fantastic, but I meant things like science as well. And if I'd been writing, I could have said that sentence and like put a period. And if I'd been illustrating, I could have put that sentence, a period, and a picture of Einstein. But in this case, I had all these constraints of design and image relations that said, well, all right, I have to zoom from here to here. And I've set these images in the time that the Arabian Nights tales were written down. So now I need something that fits into all these things I'm juggling. What's going on in science in that time period, in that part of the world. And that pushes me to do a whole bunch of research, which pushes me to discover that, well, this man named Al-Tusi is doing this work in astronomy to figure out how the planets are moving, that 300 years later gets picked up by Copernicus. And I've got this page about Copernicus, and all of a sudden, all these ideas like flow together. But they only flow together because I'm working in visuals from the start. There's nothing about my outline or about the ideas in general that says, hey, you should go research a bit of obscure astronomical calculations coming from the Arab world in the 1300s. But the drawings say, you need to solve this, and you need to figure out how to make this drawing work. Or this page composition work. And so that's the thing I see is like when I learn to trust that, which is often very slow, it takes me in directions that I'm always surprised by. And that's maybe sort of an extreme example, but I think it's always the case for me. And I think it's always, my students don't necessarily do research on that level, but whether they come in as drawers or whether they come in as not drawers, and I get I get a lot of both, that they change how they think no matter what their skills are. And often the ones that are unskilled change it even more because they're more open to it than the skilled ones might be. That when they come to understand the form, they find all these really profound ways to ask their questions and to perform their thinking.
It sounds like your process is quite non-linear, that the whole project as a whole is kind of evolving at the same time, and then you just sort of wrangle it back in at the end. Because the act of reading a book is quite linear, isn't it? We sort of start at the beginning and we work our way through, but you're creating it in a way that seems to be kind of holistic. Is there a tension there? Yes,
tension of slowness. There's it's hard. I mean, I've made too many books, so it's hard to really answer that question for the length of it, but there's I've got an idea, and then there's a lot of sketches and words and some early research that says, all right, now I kind of know things. And then there's more to say, all right, well, this is the general, this is how the ideas are going to break down. They're going to be in this chunk and this chunk and this chunk. But then when I get to the chapters, I got to do that again. Like what is, and then the new work, I've really pushed myself. The Unflattening has it's sort of somewhat an accident, but as I was drawing it, my wife would walk by and she'd say, oh, I've never seen a page composition I haven't seen you do one like that before. And then she'd walk by again and she'd say the same thing. And somewhere in there, I was like, you know what? I'm not going to have any that repeat. There's going to be no pages that have the same design on them, which was happening by accident.
You seem like a glutton for punishment there. You'd like to give yourself the constraints.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been, and then from teaching, we did I do in my advanced making course, I do a thing on just on how to use grids, regular grids. And then I was like, well, what if we use hexagons or circles? And so I've done some, digging with help from social media to find some good examples of all these things. So I collect them for my class and for myself. And then in the new work, I've thought, well, what if each chapter has something that sort of visually holds it together, which has been both interesting and painful experience. But so when I get to the chapter plan, then I know the sort of general thing the chapter is going to cover. Now it's a new round of research to really dive in and figure out, what is this about? What are the ideas I've got to cover? And then how do they fit in this, whatever formal, if there is one, how do they fit together in the thing? And when I finish that, then I get down to then there'll be like a thumbnail of the chapter, but then each individual page will have a new version of that, a new round of research, maybe stuff I've already read, but because life is taking so slow, it might be I have to remind myself of it, or it might just be, there's more. When I actually get to the detail level, I realize I didn't know as much about it as I thought. Like I had a general idea, but now I need to understand it in a much denser way. And so that will change the drawing, right? It'll change how the pieces fit together and what I include and how I say it. And even, this is a really interesting thing, I think, and I'll see if it's easier to say with pictures, but if you have, I don't understand the idea I want to write down, and it has a certain, this goes first and this comes second. But the way that the picture composed has to be in an opposite way because of how the parts interact. You then have to find a way to say the same thing, but in a different sequence. So there's this back and forth push and pull between trying to figure out, it really shapes how at least me, it really shapes how I write by all these compositional choices. I find it fascinating. For me, it's very slow, but it always leads me to places that surprise me. And how did I think of that? And I think the truth is I didn't think of it by sitting in my chair and having big ideas. I thought of it by making drawings and looking at them and interacting and iterating them and seeing where they took me.
Yeah, it's that phrase, trust the process, isn't it? It's like you just got to start and keep doing the work and knowing that it will lead you somewhere. I wanted to talk a little bit about unflattening specifically, and I always hesitate before I tell people what their own books are about. So the way my interpretation that it's talking about education and the opening sequences and sort of depicting a journey through education and an education system that kind of narrows our worldview, that we go off into different paths. There's one of the binaries that we might be kind of funneled off into is this kind of arts and sciences division. But it seems like you've kind of transcended that. Was that your experience of education? It was definitely my experience of education, and I was very much down the art path. To the point where I kind of realised, because I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, I know that you've got sort of maths background, and I'm so far down the art pathway that I don't really even know what people do when they do maths at university. I have no concept of what that even means. I went to art college, so I didn't even have any friends from university who were doing anything other than arts type subjects. It's a mystery to me. Yeah. So I'm interested in how you're bridging those worlds.
Yeah. So one, I'd say that wasn't, the sort of nightmare escape I open with was not my experience. Mine was quite positive. I witnessed that. My parents are both educators. My dad's a physics teacher and was a coach. And he's the kind of teacher you want. He's the teacher that you want to have to get you excited about the world.
Inspiring. Yeah,
inspiring, but very much like, this is why it's exciting, and here's how you find your way into it, and how we learn alongside like physics, we could tell you the formulas, right? Here's the formulas, learn it and solve this problem. Or you could say, well, this is the stuff Galileo was wrestling with or whatever. Here's how he started to figure it out. Let's solve these things ourselves. And you sort of follow that, and then it becomes yours, right? It becomes yours rather than handed to you. So he's coming from that. My mom is in environmental studies. She's a naturalist and taught environmental studies at a elementary school. So I had both of them as well. And so they're both, very curious and concerned with the world. And so those things really shaped me for sure. But also when I would see, the sort of narrowness of school, like it didn't impact me. Like it didn't like squelch me, but I witnessed it. And in truth, like when you asked about going into art stuff, I really did not like art class. I liked making it, and I was always known as the kid who drew, and I did the drawings for things. But there was this narrowness often in art classes about, well, this is, we're going to do a thing this way, and there's never enough time, I think, in little kid art, which I like that better, but it was just never like, I'm really into this, I want to make it for a long time, and it'd be like, you got to stop, and that's it, we got to move on to the next thing. So there was I never took art in like high school or college, but so my experience was positive, but I would witness this other thing, and certainly, my undergrad degree is in mathematics. I mostly had positive experiences, but I think it made me sad along the way. Like, this is cool stuff. This is like part of being human, right? Part of being human is understanding mathematics. Part of being human is understanding arts, how to make things. And part of being human too is I played sports. Like I played a lot of sports, but then I continued on and was as a college tennis player. And then I say I'm a bottom level pro tennis player, but what it really means is that I tried to play on that level. That doesn't mean I was successful at it. And then I taught tennis all the way through doctoral school to make a living. So to me, it seemed like that's, humans are bodies, humans are thinkers, humans are expressors. Like that's us. That's us. And it really, watching things that happen to people who are like, oh, well, I can't do math. I'm not a math person, or I'm not creative. And I just don't believe it. Yeah. Right? I don't believe it. I mean, obviously people lean directions, but I think so much of it is early experiences, whether it's in your home or whether it's in your school or whether it's just part of culture that says, we have these kind of people and those kind of people. And I think it's limiting us, and it's artificial. And like I said, I had one really bad math class at the end of like my senior year. And I really got how it must feel to be in, like, it just, he was not explaining things. He was careless, and it was kind of a miserable experience. And, but I really could see how it must feel to a lot of people who were dropped into a math class, weren't that comfortable with it to begin with, but then were in a place where the person wasn't bringing them into the conversation, but was expecting them to somehow know it anyway. So again, the thing isn't about my experience. It's about witnessing something that I thought was really unhealthy, and it makes me sad. I mean, I think a lot of the work is motivated by a real strong belief in the complexity and capability of humans, and then how sometimes that feels like it's squandered because we've been told that we can only do this much. Yeah, I don't know. I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's making me think so much, just in terms of kind of reading, and we look a lot about self-perception as a reader and how important it is for children and adults to have that kind of self-perception that they are a reader, and the kind of the motivation, the access, the habit, all of the different things that form that self-perception. And I guess it's the same for all of those things that you're talking about. It's the same for, self-perception of, being a mathematician, or self-perception of, as being somebody that can participate or has a place to participate in sports, and the value of kind of role models and the wider culture supporting access and things like that is so important. Right. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah.
Let's just end there. It's complicated.
Absolutely.
At the end of the podcast.
It's complicated. There we go.
I'm really interested to hear about, we've had hints about your journey, but I'm really interested to know how you came to have the kind of role that you have now and how that evolved. Can you tell us a little bit about your career trajectory, I guess?
Sure. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, undergrad, I did make comics. Like I kept doing it, but they were just kind of on the side.
Did you self-publish
Um,
those? Did you just, how were you handing them out to
no,
friends
I
or?
mean, I didn't finish them. I had a lot of unfinished projects. I had a philosophy independent study that I designed this very complicated comic about the butterfly effect, and uh, I don't know. The movie Sliding Doors kind of took a bunch of the ideas that I had in it. So I'm not really, but just the general concept. So I never finished it. I have a bunch of unfinished stuff. Like in high school and junior high, I had, I published quite a bit of my Locker Man series, but they were quick and I had access to a copier. So there's a lot of unfinished stuff. And then I spent a few years on the tennis tour and then stopped. And then I ended up doing a master's in mathematics and art around the creative process. And then
Cool.
Also I have a fine arts degree. I have a fine arts degree in painting, which is kind of curious because I'm a lousy painter.
I bet you're not.
But then no, I am. I mean, I guess it's relative. But my older brother said, let's start a magazine about art in Detroit, about arts and culture in Detroit. And he had been a theater writer for a while. And so I said, okay. And then I became very obsessed with documenting what was going on in the art community in Detroit for 6 years. And kind of ended up running this magazine solo for that time and writing. I must have written about at least 3 reviews, not counting editorials and editing other people's stuff or interviews and things every week for 6 years. So I got very close to that community and became very much a champion of that community. It was very difficult to leave. And then my wife to be said, do you want to come to New York, where she was? And I said, sure. And I figured I was at that point, I taught some courses on public speaking and a little bit on writing, but mostly public speaking, which I just loved. So I saw, I mean, this is kind of relevant. My parents are teachers. And while I hadn't done many things that looked like teaching in a classroom, I taught tennis and I ran this arts magazine and really saw the educational side of it as my goal. I'm a little less interested in sort of art history and more interested in why this might be of interest to you, how you can find your own way into this art. And maybe you want to make it, or maybe you want to at least understand how it applies to you. So I kept seeing how all the stuff I was doing really made sense in education. And then in 2004, I was asked to be in a political art show around the U.S. presidential election. And I didn't have many days left to do it. And so I was like, well, I can make a comic. And I made this very Scott McCloud-like comic about security, and it was 4 pages, and I was quite pleased with it. And then they had a second show after the election, which was much harder. And I wanted to do something. As much as I love McCloud's work, I thought, he's done it. I don't want to make work that looks like that with me and my T-shirt and stuff. So I took a different influence, Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbe's This Is Information. It was in the 9/11 tribute anthology comic, and the sort of use of visual and verbal metaphor to make more of an essay. And that really triggered something for me. And I made this comic about voting called A Show of Hands, and every panel is about hands. So that sparked me coming back to comics. And then shortly after that, we put on an exhibition of games and art. And my buddy said, why don't you make the essay as a comic? And I'm like, all right. So I did this somewhat long form comic on the history of games, how games work, and then sort of applied it to philosophy of life. And it's those things when my wife said, I think you should come to New York. I said, well, I'm doing all this stuff that looks like education, and I really like being in the classroom, but being an adjunct is not a job. It's a job, but you can't survive on it. So why not get my doctorate while I'm at it? So I sort of stumbled into Teachers College at Columbia and said, hey, this is the kind of stuff I want to make, and this is what it looks like if you'll have me. And they, for whatever reason, said yes. And so I started being a doctoral student in education there, kind of quite naively about lots of these things. And initially coming in, I knew I was going to do my work in comics, but I did not know that was a big deal. I just assumed from Maus to Understanding Comics to Persepolis, all things that were out at that point, that argument was long won, but it hadn't been in academia. So as I began working on this, I realized that part of my work had to be an argument for its own existence. and really become an argument for the existence of itself, but things like it that could be comics, but could be in other multimodal forms. And for whatever reason, I think I just hit the right moment in history. There was interest in comics and interested in sort of multimodal and digital scholarship that it got a lot of attention before I'd even started making. I mean, I made other things, but I hadn't made that yet, or even started making it. So which really led to me becoming a proselytizer for comics as belonging in the academy, both as scholarship and as reading and as all those other things. Despite the work being well known, still not a lot of job prospects because there's no place for somebody who does that. We haven't, there's interest in hearing about it, but not that's just not a job posting. So I ended up doing a last minute postdoc at the University of Calgary under the comic scholar Bart Beatty. And after that, I ended up at San Francisco State. I was a job in visual rhetoric, and I seemed close enough to something I might do that I said, sure, I'll apply here and just see what happens. And they ended up being interested. I got the job, and shortly after that, my chair, it's a very unusual situation, I think. Or uncommon, because I think most universities wouldn't have been quite so open to this, said, why don't you, create comics classes? And I was like, okay, great. And then as soon as we launched them, she said, why don't you go ahead and write a minor? So within a year, we launched this comic studies minor, which leapfrogged a whole bunch of places that had comics classes for 10 and 20 years, but mostly just because I happen to have an administrator who is like, yeah, you should do this. Students like it. This is what you do. Why don't we, she recognized that this was an area that had a lot of interest in it. And I just ran with it. So we've had this minor ever since, and it continues to grow, and we've grown new things to it. Students just keep flocking to it and keep teaching me new things.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your students and how you approach. Can you correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm imagining students coming from all different disciplines, and some of them might be quite far along in terms of their understanding of comics or their knowledge of comics, and others it might be something that just piques their interest and they're just seeing what will happen. What's your starting point then when you've got a group with kind of these diverse backgrounds and diverse starting points themselves? How do you introduce them to comics? And I'm wondering if you see that different response across the different kind of groups, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one, I mean, it's interesting. We were talking about arts and maths and art school before. And I think I was quite resistant, not that a lot of opportunities were there, but to ending up in an art school, not because I don't like it, not because but I really like the idea of having all kinds of students, to having math students and science students and writing students, just whatever, so that we could get their perspectives. And also, thinking of some of the stuff I said about human capability before, helping them find their own way in. I mean, my early classes, but even before I came there, were almost exclusively non-drawers, which was really interesting. And that really helped me figure out how I wanted to approach it. Now, the more the program's there, I definitely get more, people who've said, they see this opportunity to do a thing they already like, which is new. But I approach it my very first time teaching, when I was still a student at Columbia, I came up with an activity it's on my website called Grids and Gestures, which gets people in about 7 minutes to think about the shape of the experiences across a single day, and they organize them in some sort of panel-esque structure, and they use various mark making rather than representational drawing to indicate what's happening or how they felt throughout the day. And I really like to start there because, one, it gives the non-drawers like an in.
Yeah.
2, it shows them how much they know about drawing, even if they don't draw. 3, they start thinking about space on a comics page in ways that, that reveal a lot of understanding long before you study any theory or anything about it. And then I think, so that's true for the non-drawers, but I think for the drawers who they're just ready to do this thing, and they're going to do their 5 panels or whatever and just drop the things in there, it starts to push them a little bit outside of that preconceived notion of it. And then all the activities we do, I now that we're back in the classroom again, I return to that, but we do a lot of collaboration, not in terms of like do a project together, but fast things where one person draws and then it goes to the next person, and they're sort of, they don't have much time, which is a constraint that helps. You know, they don't have much time. They don't have to come up with it themselves. They have to keep responding, and they get to see everybody's work and sort of imitate it if you have to like continue their story. So that pushes them all. And then I'm very, I do a lot of making in these classes, either writing class or very quick activities that they can do at home. And then they have to post all of it, which means they get to see everyone's work. So it's not for me so much, but it's for them to learn from each other and see how, this really skilled drawer did this thing and this really not skilled drawer. I have this guy in class he was in my intro class, and I sort of twisted his arm to come back and take the advanced one. And he just would go on about how he doesn't draw and doesn't know what he's doing in here, but he would make the most interesting sort of compositions. And he's very very neat and tidy but curious about how he lays out things. And we did an activity where some student just relayed a story from her life, and they had to very quickly come up with thumbnails for it. Everybody did some pretty good takes, and you could see sort of cinematic differences with most of theirs. And then there was this guy, and he had like left most of the page. There's a lot of empty space as these little tiny panels moved through the page. And then it had doesn't matter, but it had footprints from the character in the story that were sort of symbolic, moving through some of that empty space. But like, he just, it's just so different and so fascinating. And he doesn't come from a world of illustration. I don't even remember what his background is, but so now you're in a classroom where you can watch what he's doing, and maybe that sparks some other ideas for you. And I think that's the best part about classes is they have a chance. I put them through some paces. Here's a constraint. Make this, respond to how you came to school, how you ended up here. Do it in 3 panels and also do it in 2 pages. Tell this, and it might not be the same story. You interpret it how you want. So they come with their 2 versions, and then another 30 or 40 students come with their 2 versions. And now we have all this material that we can say, oh, wow, what can we learn from all this? And what can we be inspired and steal from? And then also if you can turn it back to saying, well, here's what I did. Now we can look at some examples from like professional work and see how the thing you're doing ties into that. And it becomes a really generative process. And I think having the non-drawers in the room, I think really enriches the class, because they bring, I don't know, I'll say one last thing. And I had a mathematician, a master's in mathematics in class, a few classes a couple years ago. And she really wasn't a drawer, but she would bring all these, really conceptual things and then try to tackle them on the page. And just fascinating. And she ended up becoming pretty solid at drawing along the way, because we kept doing these things, and she was looking at people around her and all the activities we did. But at the same time, she was teaching us so much about how to use the page that just probably wouldn't have occurred to most of us. So it's really enriching, I think, having those different skill sets and different disciplines that everybody's coming from is really a positive thing.
Yeah, it sounds really exciting. I think one of the just personal reflection, we were talking before we hit record about sort of my background, and I was saying that it's sort of more since I've left the classroom, I've had more time to kind of really investigate and get really interested. But one of the frustrations of that is then I don't have a class to go back and try things with, and I get all these ideas and these things that I want to do. I can't scratch that itch. It's difficult. But do you think that you're talking about your students' experiences, but I imagine that you also that's a real source of inspiration for you in your own work as well?
Oh, absolutely. It certainly a ton of unflattening came from thinking of things that I wanted to explain to students. So a lot of the pages about comics came from like, well, here's the idea. How can I articulate that in comics to them? So a lot of the stuff came from that. A lot of the things I want to teach about, which I'm pushed to teach about because of what they bring to it, end up in the work. And then the work helps me think about things I want to share with them. And then it goes back. And then, like I mentioned this constraint stuff about circles and hexagons, it's just like stuff I thought, well, what can we do with this in class? And then I'm like, well, maybe I should try it with my work. So there's definitely lots of feedback in both directions there. I think the hardest thing for me is I do a lot of very quick activities with them where like, you draw for 2 minutes, everybody does the panel for 2 minutes and they pass, and then you continue, and there's some kind of, there's some kind of constraint on it so that there's coherence to it. And some lesson they're taking from it. But I always want to join in. And a few times I try, but I can't really pay attention to the class very well when I'm doing that. But I watch at how facile they become and how quick they are at solving problems. And I'm super envious because I'm not so quick at solving problems. And I want to join in, and maybe someday I'll just do it and get over it. But anyway, it's fun to watch how well they thrive.
I wanted to talk a little bit about academia. There's clear themes for me in your work around kind of the importance of play and creativity, and also lots of things that we've been discussing today, imagination. And those seem very far away from words that we usually associate with academia, academic writing, that kind of rigor of academia. And one of the things, again, we will have these kind of debates around terms like creative writing. Is that an appropriate term? What people understand as creative writing, does that really encapsulate what we mean when we're talking about writing? And I just wondered what your thoughts were around, is there a kind of restriction around academic writing being perceived to being quite dry versus creative writing? And how do those kind of link for you? I don't know if that's really a question. I've just rambled a bit.
Well, I started in my head responding to the first thing about play. Which maybe I'll start, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it. Break my question down into sensible chunks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a funny thing. I'll give you an example. The first time, no, not the first, one of the first times I taught my comics class while I was still a student, we had some textbooks, not textbooks, but like McLeod's book and things like that we used. And they came, for whatever reason, the bookstore got them really late. And so I always was doing making activities with my students, but usually after we'd done stuff. And so here I was like, well, let's just do the making first. And, I'm already a tennis pro, so I should know these things, but it's still, well, you'll see. So we had a couple weeks where we're making these things and we're trying out activities. And at some point I start to apologize to them. Well, I'm like, I'm sorry, we didn't really learn. And then I stopped myself, and like, they learned an enormous amount.
Yeah.
They learned so much by the act of making, by the act of playing, about how to do things, and about, they're very analytical. They're doing all this stuff, but they're doing it through the act of making. But we're so conditioned to think, you've got to have read this stuff. And then, there's a great book called Mathematician's Lament, which is about how math is not taught well, and students don't like it as a result, or don't think they can do it. And it opens, it's got a preface, or I don't know, the opening chapter is about a musician's nightmare, and how the musician, in school you learn what notes are, and then as you get farther advanced, you learn how to put the notes together. And then maybe if you make it to doctoral school, you get to play notes, you get to play music, right? And that's crazy. You say that out loud and you're like, well, that's crazy. That's not how you learn music.
Yeah,
but it is kind of how you learn mathematics, right? Like mathematics, you don't actually get to play a lot until at the end, when you've done all this other stuff. And I think it's true often in our subjects. And that when we do play, we dismiss it as, well, that was just our fun activity. But like I mentioned, this activity, I asked the students to say, tell me how you got here. And they can interpret it like how they ended up at a university, how they ended up in life, whatever, or the literal, like, how did I get to class this day? And do it in 3 panels. And also do it in 2 pages, however many panels you want to break that into. And so they've got to make decisions about the 3 panels. What do I include? And they've got to make decisions about the 2 pages. Are they the same story, but just different, different amount of panels? Are they totally different stories, which often they are? And then, so they're playing, right? but then they've learned something about pacing. They've learned something about space. They've learned a lot. I mean, and so we can take that, and then sure, I can talk to them about something about time in comics or spatial thing or braiding or whatever. I can give them some of those theories, and we can look at more pages. But that very act of making it makes all that other stuff real, and says, oh yeah, I see that, how I'm doing that thing in my work. And then they own it too. I mean, they made it, right? But they own it. They own the theory in ways that they don't necessarily or at all own it if you've stopped at reading about it, which I'm not sometimes I think I may overstate these things, and I'm not. I like reading theory. I like reading word books. But I think without the act of play, without that thing where I caught myself that, a long time ago saying, oh, sorry, we didn't learn anything. No, I was quite wrong. We're learning an enormous amount. And, as parents, like, we know our small humans learn an enormous amount about how they roll around on the floor, how they pick things up, how they reenact things. And I, somewhere we say that's no longer how it's done.
Yeah.
And I think that's a horrible mistake. I understand, it's easier. It's easier to instruct than have the sort of unwieldiness of play.
Yeah, that's made me. I don't know whether this is something that happens in the school system in America, but definitely in the UK, due to kind of our framework, sort of quality assurance, Ofsted inspections that schools go through and are graded on. One of the things that quite a lot of schools do is that at the start of each lesson, the children kind of stick in what the learning intention is for that lesson. And quite often I've felt as a teacher, I don't really want to tell them this at the start. I know what I want. I know what I know what I'm kind of aiming for, but also I want there to be this possibility that we learn something that I wasn't expecting. But so it just felt like the act of sticking that learning intention at the start was then restricted because the children knew what the outcome was supposed to be. And I understand the argument for that, but I also think there's an argument against as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you framed it, like learn something you didn't expect. And I think, I think that should be true in our classroom, and it should be true in it's definitely, like I said before, true in my making. Like, I don't expect that this is going to happen. And, when you're done, it might look like, all right, well, I guess you knew where you were headed, but in reality, you don't. Or at least in reality, I never do. And I think classrooms should look like that. There's obviously, it can't be willy-nilly. There are directions you need to go. There are things, but that doesn't, how you get there and how students own it is a very different thing. We have a long ways to go on that. It's complicated. I think that's what you said.
I think that can be the tagline for this episode of the podcast. So actually, that links really nicely to the next thing I was going to ask you. That at the end of Unflattening, you kind of end on the assertion that there's always more to discover, and you've sort of hinted about current projects and things that you're working on at the moment. And so I wanted to ask, what have you discovered since? I mean, not everything, obviously. I'm sure you've discovered lots of things, but what kind of, in terms of, where is the focus of your thoughts and, the work that you're doing now? Where have you moved on to since Unflattening?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, Unflattening was very much an argument about, how school could look different and how scholarship could look different, and specifically how comic books could and should be legitimate form of scholarship. And here's why. But in talking about it and in teaching, coming back to one of the first questions, was so much about a different way of thinking. So, when I speak about it or do workshops around it, and again, all my classes, it's like, how do we find these other ways of thinking that bring more of ourselves into the picture? And so the newer work, which is very slow, is going to address that more directly. It's sort of hinted at in this one with part of a chapter. And like I said, I talk about it a lot, but it's not actually in there. So to talk about how much thinking can come in our mark making and in our bodies. And it's really interesting to me. The first year of starting to think about it, I read a lot. And I made it, rough notes, and I really understood all the ideas I wanted to cover, but it just felt really flat. It felt like I'd made a textbook. It didn't feel like mine at all. And I was really stuck for a while. And the book is so much about, and I know this, it's supposed to be about how thinking doesn't come from sitting and putting your hand under your chin and waiting for ideas to come. It comes from moving, and from moving your hand and moving your drawing pencil and whatever. And yet I kept trying to think myself to solutions. And it was really a very memorable moment where I was like, all right, what am I doing here? And I got out my giant sheets of newsprint, which is how all my outline stuff has happened. And I just started making marks. And there were things around my room that triggered thoughts. And I've been immersed in this for a while. And all of a sudden, this whole opening sequence came to mind in the sketches that made it mine and made it, put these ideas in this really exciting thing. It really just caught me off guard. It seemed kind of obvious once it was done, but it didn't exist until this moment that I started making the marks. And it's the thing. Here I am both working on, and I should know better because it's what I'm working on. But I still, that lesson to trust, as going back to our earlier thing, to trust the process, to actually get in there and draw and see what happens, rather than trying to push through a research solution. I still had to learn it the hard way, even though if you asked me, I could tell you this, but for myself, I just couldn't push past that. So I think, coming back to a lot of the earlier questions, this is true for me, and my end product is going to be a comic, but I think it's true for all of us in thinking about our bodies and thinking about mark making. The reason everybody should make comics is not necessarily because everyone needs to publish finished, nice comics, but because it's a great way to think in spatial ways and in visual ways and in these other nonlinear ways that maybe really help you get at something that maybe at the end of the day, you've translated back into some, more linear form, but that will help you get there. And I think that's true. I think that's true of comics makers, but it's true of everyone as this really profound way to generate ideas and generate understanding of your own thinking.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. I feel like this is going to be one of those conversations where, over the next fortnight, weeks, months, I'm going to be thinking of things that I wish I'd asked you. So I'm probably going to pester you with emails.
That sounds good. It's a treat. We can do it again if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great. I was going to ask you about accessibility for comics with blind readers. I know you've been working in collaboration with organisations looking at how comics can be made accessible for blind readers. And I went to a kind of online symposium, and it was amazing because it seemed things were being again. It was that kind of experimentation, that air of discovering something new, and things were kind of being explored. Readers were feeding back what it was like, their experience, whether they felt that it was accessible or whether it had that kind of essence of comic about the kind of solutions that were being proposed. And it was fascinating to just sit and listen to those conversations happen. But it did feel like there wasn't really a solution yet. So I'm wondering what some of your key learnings have been in that space.
Yeah, this project sort of emerged by accident. I was aware, I'm trying to make comics accessible, but even while I was doing it, I realized that by doing it visually, I was excluding people completely. And then because my metaphor was all about the vision, I was kind of doubling down on that, but I didn't have any solution to it. And periodically I would just save, anytime I'd see something about comics for blind readers, I would save it and just put it on my website and remember it. And then at my university, I had a colleague who worked in that. So I would ask her periodically, is this a good idea or is this a sighted person's idea of what is good for a blind person? And usually they're the latter. And then I had a student do her master's thesis as a comic, and we had to make it ADA compliant. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity, not like a problem, but an opportunity. And so we got a small bit of grant money, which we used to host a conversation just to explore some ideas, which I put on social media, and we ended up with 800 people showing up for it. And two things. One, realized that there was a lot of interest and a lot of need for this, and that no one was really doing it. And two, that what I was hoping is that I would find some best practices and that I would make my work that way and my students' work, and I would follow best practices going forward. And what I really learned is that there's no such thing, that there's no one size fits all for this at all. There's people who want, who've been blind from birth and they want sort of the meaning, but they don't necessarily want some of the details. Whereas somebody who lost their sight later might really want to know what, Batman's cape looks like and how the page works and a lot of other things. And some people are skilled in sort of tactile things and some aren't. So there's this big continuum or spectrum of possibilities. And the most recent thing we did is we had a couple events. We had a design competition to design accessible comics. And then just in the midst of it, we'd made this comic. My colleague and I had made a comic for MIT Technology Review on the challenge of making comics accessible, which we also made an audio version at the same time. But in the midst of doing that, it sparked this idea like, well, maybe I should look at my own work and just see what's possible. And we had an audio description team. We asked them what they thought was possible, and they just started trying it, despite us saying, no, we're not quite there yet. But they just started trying it. And that raised a lot of questions like, would anybody care to read this? Would anybody want to hear it? And then so we tried ourselves, our two different versions, one where I sort of described it at great depth, like what is it from the artist's point of view, like what matters on the page, what are all the elements here, and my colleague took more of a like I can maybe ignore what's on the page and just get at the meaning of it. And we had this discussion 2 weeks ago with this panel of blind experts or experts in accessibility. And it was really interesting. I mean, they opened up what, they were much more, I thought I was going to exhaust them with how much I'd given them, which I think somewhat I did, but also they were really intrigued by it. And they were really intrigued by the piece that sort of got into the ideas, but didn't necessarily deal with the visuals. And they really, what came out of it is how much the reader wants control over it. Like how much, like, can I zoom in a little deeper, versus, which we can do visually, right? You can look closer more. Yeah. But so it really, I mean, when we just debriefed with them again in a conversation this week, and they suggested what you really need is a new medium that has, because I had made a tactile thing for one of my pages too, so they could feel where I was talking. It didn't really have much detail, but it sort of let them move around the page in the way that I was describing. And, so what's interesting, and I think back to Scott McCloud's got a sentence in Understanding Comics about how the visual is doing all the other modes, right? Like the sound and talking and move, like it's doing all those things. And so I think to reproduce comics in a way that's meaningful and engaging, you kind of got to use a whole bunch of, all the other modes to do what the visual is doing by itself.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Which is daunting. It's really daunting. I mean, I think we should just be doing this, right? Like kids who want to know what's going on in Spider-Man should just have access to the narrative of Spider-Man. It just should be done. Like the industry should just get on it. To get at work that's a little more challenging, it's hard.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
But it really, you're taking a spatially arranged medium that you read at your own pace and has all these nonlinear juxtapositions, and you're trying to jam it into if it's audio description, into a time-based medium. It's really hard, and it presents, it makes you really aware of what you've done on the page and just how complex comics are, or as we say today, it's complicated.
Because exactly. There's there's obviously there's a sequence, but there's also the kind of simultaneousness of it as well. When you look at that page,
right?
Oof, it's hard.
Yeah. So it's, even like just reading the simplest comic, like when do you read the sound effect? If you read it out loud to your kid, like does the sound effect come before this? Does it come? when you're looking at it, you don't have to think about it. You just feel the sound effect, right? But when do I say it? It's really hard, and all comics are complicated in that way, which is awesome. I mean, I think in this conversation we thought, film description is actually easier because film is time-based, and there's the sound and there's all this other stuff that's already doing it. So you're just adding descriptions so they know the characters are doing what. But comics, which seem, in their flatness and staticness, seem like they're just kind of a lame medium, right? They just sit there flat on the page. But I think the opposite is true. They really have so much potential for communication in really sophisticated ways. It's complicated.
We are moving to the end of the podcast now. And just at the end, I like to have a little moment where guests can pick out some key takeaways. Maybe it's complicated, might be the one, but that might kind of influence listeners' teaching practice. There's a mix of different, librarians, teachers, academics, also comics creators that listen into the podcast. A few pointers on things maybe to leave people pondering as they finish listening.
Yeah, that's a big question for me. I mean, I think comics are really cool. I think they're really cool, and I with students, I'm like, if you leave this after we've looked at some that do some really unusual things, I'm like, if you leave this experience and all you've left with is that comics are a really cool and strange way to do things, that's pretty good. Which defies your expectations. If you think, oh, this is going to be the light version of this or that. No, I mean, it can be, right? But, you can read Idiot's Guides to anything too. That word books can be just as light. So I think understanding how much comics offer us, and not only offer us, I guess, in the sort of ways we've been talking about with juxtaposition and layering and things like that, but also offer different ways of making meaning on the page, which means, or different ways of skills. So we've talked already about the skills my students, the diversity of skills they come with, but also that comics welcomes all of those. You get people who are lush illustrators, can do all this incredible detail work, but also, the stick figure cartoonists or the ones who really don't even use pictures. And maybe this is not a key takeaway anymore, but I do a thing where we do a pictureless comic. So you can use the panel composition, captions, sound effects, word balloons, whatever, but you don't draw stuff in it. And it's a fun activity.
That's cool.
Thinking about. Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and it's a simple one just because it doesn't take as long as some of the other ones. But I had a student a few years ago who she really was great in the class, but she didn't want to draw. She did not like she was very self-conscious about it and convinced she was no good at it. And she ended up doing her final as a pictureless comic. I think I encouraged her to say, yeah, go for it. And it was brilliant and incredibly powerful. It was about a personal domestic abuse situation, and it stopped our class cold. And it, I don't know, maybe 16 pages of just with no, there's a tiny drawing on the very last panel on the last page. But it, she understood the form. She understood the ways that she could play with it. And she used the skills she had very effectively. She wasn't trying, if she tried to draw the comic like one of the drawers in class, she would have made kind of a lame comic probably, just because she would have been trying and falling short. But instead she found her way. She found her way of doing it. And when she found her way, she made this thing that was really profound and something I think everybody would want to read. And I think we all, I think comics are that for us. If you really start to think about comics in ways that comics are this flexible medium that allow all kinds of skills, I think people can find their own way in and their own way to really make meaning in ways that will surprise them. I think will always surprise you once you get past, can I draw a nose that looks really nice? Yeah. How's that for a takeaway?
That's amazing. Thank you. That's really, really good. I feel like, I want to push myself a bit more and try and actually
all right.
I've put my comics making down for a while. I don't know, like, do you like that? I feel like I've got kind of, well, I know you said you've got half finished projects. I've got half finished things, and I've just kind of put them down, and yeah, I need to pick them back up again.
And trust it. Just make them and see what happens.
So our final point on the podcast, if we were to add one comic or book about comics to our to-be-read piles tomorrow, what would you recommend we read?
Oh, boy. I'm terrible at this question.
So Unflattening was recommended by Helen Jones in a previous episode.
Thanks, Helen.
Yeah, she's a massive fan. She's really cool doing PhD research into children making their own comics. It's really cool.
Cool.
So, yeah, what would you recommend that we read? Could just be something you've enjoyed reading recently.
Well, this week, my daughter and I read Kay. I think it's called Kay Gets in Trouble. It's a young reader comic that you figure out super quickly is Kafka stories, but for children, which I just absolutely loved. I mean, sort of whimsical drawings and just horrible humans to this poor boy, but yet they're still weirdly hopeful despite that, that's where they stray from Kafka. I just loved it. So that's a younger reader one.
That sounds very cool.
So many things. How do I pick one? I'm looking at books on my shelf and there's so much, I just don't know how to tell you one. But there's a lot of good. I haven't read this yet, but I'm really intrigued by it. There's an adaptation of C.L.R. James Toussaint Louverture, and it's the story of the only successful slave revolt in history. And I looked at it a little bit in my class, and so it's at my nonfiction class. So it's a history book retelling of a play. He uses the form really well. Closest thing that was on my shelf. So
that sounds really interesting.
That
sounds good.
So much good stuff. I'll make you a list of 20 things. That'll be easier.
I would love you to make me a list of 20 things.
Sorry.
Please do make me a list of 20 things. I would love that.
All right. Okay. That sounds better.
Thank you so much for spending time with me today, for talking about your work. It's been so interesting. And yeah, as I say, I think I'll probably come knocking on your inbox in the future to ask you questions as they occur to me. But it's been really thought-provoking for me. So thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.
There you have it. Thank you so much to Nick for setting my brain on fire, really, and thinking about all of the possibilities I've yet to explore in comics. I'm particularly fascinated by that aspect of accessibility and that complexity of meeting the nuanced needs of different blind users. Not everyone coming from the same perspective, people wanting different things. Really, really interesting about how to provide accessibility in a way that suits the individual. I'm going to make a recommendation this episode to go along with Nick's recommendation. And I thought it'd be nice to give you a heads up to some of the people coming onto the podcast a little later in the series. Maybe you can get ahead. You can read their books as well before you listen to their interview. So I'm currently reading Isabel Greenberg's graphic novel, Young Hag, which came out this year. I'm really familiar with Isabel's work and I knew I would like this, but I absolutely love it. I'm enthralled with the story. I've been laughing out loud. The use of colour is phenomenal. It's something I think for Key Stage 3 and up, but just a really great story entrenched in Arthurian legend and very, very witty. Highly recommended. It's got me very excited to interview Isabel in a few weeks' time, and that episode will be coming out at some point over the summer. So there's plenty of time to get hold of some of Isabel's work and have a little read ahead if you would like to. Thanks to ALCS for sponsoring today's episode. As you know, we often have writers on Comic Boom speaking about their work, and ALCS is a non-for-profit organisation supporting its 120,000 plus members to collect money for all of the secondary uses of their work. Things like photocopies of their work, digital reproductions, even use in education. And they also produce some fantastic resources to support educators to explore topics like copyright and plagiarism in the classroom, which I think is always a really interesting thing to be able to bring in, you know, when there's complaints around the person next to them copying. And obviously, as young people get older, it becomes even more prescient, especially in this age of AI. It's something we really need to build awareness of. So over the next few weeks, I'll be highlighting a few of their resources that might be worth checking out and building into your practice. That's it from me this week. This season I've switched up to make the episodes fortnightly, just to give me a little bit more time to edit and prepare them. So Comic Boom will be back in 2 weeks' time. do not try and tune into an episode next week. It will be in 2 weeks' time. And that episode will be worth waiting for because there'll be an interview featuring James Turner, a regular contributor to the Phoenix magazine, creator of Starcat. And he talks to me just prior to the release of his new graphic novel, Toby and the Pixies, based on the I Hate Pixies serialized comics from the Phoenix. Very, very funny person. Really enjoyed talking to him. So that episode is coming in 2 weeks' time. Until then, you can follow me on Twitter on @Lucy_Braidley, and you can follow the podcast on Instagram @comic_boom_podcast. You've been listening to Comic Boom, which is produced and hosted by me, Lucy Starbuck Braidley. Thanks for listening.